Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Samer Abboud, and I'm an associate professor of global interdisciplinary studies at Villanova University. I would like to begin by thanking the organizers and all of the volunteers for bringing us together virtually, as well as the presenters and audience participants for making the last few days so wonderful. I want to give a special thanks to the translators who have what is no doubt the most unenviable task of the entire festival. I'd like to thank our four speakers today, Rana Baker, Rabea Eghbaria, Andrew Ross, and Raja Shehadeh. We are brought together today to explore some of the many facets of the ecological crises wrought by settler colonialism. This panel serves as a reminder that there is no separation between the ecological and the political, but rather that the colonization of indigenous lands depends on the violent appropriation and reorganization of nature to serve colonization. From the renaming of valleys, waterways, mountains, and villages, to the violent extraction of resources, settler colonialism has always been underpinned by an unending assault on nature that is so central to the project of cultural erasure. We'll hear today about how one wanders and walks freely in the context of occupation, how extractive industries have relied on exploited Palestinian labor, the appropriation and marshalling of progressive environmental discourse by the Israeli state against Palestinian movements, and finally, how Palestinian horticultural and pastoral practices are increasingly criminalized. Together, these interventions remind us of the myriad ways that Palestinians navigate and confront the ecological assault on their lands and their day-to-day lives. Our panelists today will be given 8 to 10 minutes each for their talks. I will then ask panelists some questions to initiate a brief collective discussion before we will move on to audience questions. I've already identified who our panelists are, but will provide a longer biography before each of their comments. Please join me in virtually welcoming them today. Thank you to everybody. Before we start with our first speaker, I have 4 very quick reminders. The first is to actively and enthusiastically post about this panel and everything that is happening during Palestine Writes by using the hashtag Palestine Writes. Second, if you are in need of translation or are interested in translation, please click the globe at the bottom of the Zoom room, and that will provide you access to our wonderful translations today. Our panel will be in English. Third, please attend the showroom that is available. Hopefully all of you have been to the wonderful virtual space that is created. Please attend the showroom where you will find books written by our panelists as well as others who have participated in the festival. Finally, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom room to ask your questions. I see that the chat is already quite active, so please use the Q&A. We will be compiling the questions and asking them to our panelists after their talks. Our first speaker today will be Raja Shehadeh, who is a lawyer and writer and the founder of the pioneering Palestinian human rights organization, Al-Haq. Shahadi is the author of several books, including the Orwell Prize-winning Palestinian Walks, as well as Strangers in the House, Occupation Diaries, Language of War, Language of Peace, A Rift in Time, Where the Line is Drawn, and his most recent book, Going Home, A Walk Through 50 Years of Occupation. He lives in Ramallah, Palestine. Raja, floor is yours. Thank you.
I would first like to express my appreciation to those amazing people who dreamed this festival, and my thanks to all those who made this dream come true. They've done a tremendous job. There is a unique beauty to nature in Palestine, and I thought it was best to begin this panel on nature by trying to evoke this beauty in words. To do this, I'll be reading from my 2008 book, Palestinian Walks, Forays into a Vanishing Landscape. This is the book. Until the early 80s, it was still possible in Palestine to take a sarha. One of the Arabic lexicon meanings of the word sarha is to allow one's imagination to wander unreservedly. The word also means a walk that allows the individual to roam freely. As our world shrinks, that of the Israelis expands, with more settlements being built, destroying forever the wadis and cliffs, and transforming the precious land which many Palestinians will never know. And so it becomes less possible to take a sarha. It could be said that the Israeli occupation has managed to restrict our imagination and imprison us in the confines of the occupation-imposed limitations and rules. Let me begin by reading to you about the Sarha and some descriptions of our beautiful land, and then explain what happened to make that unique pleasure unattainable. I'll be reading from pages 1 to 3 and 5. As a child, I used to hear my grandfather, Judge Salim, like nothing more than coming to Ramallah in the hot summer and going on a sarha with his cousin Abu Amin, leaving behind the humid coast city of Jaffa and the stultifying colonial administration which he served and whose politics he detested. It was mainly young men who went on these expeditions. They would take a few provisions and go to the open hills, disappear for the whole day, sometimes for weeks and months. They often didn't have a particular destination. To go on a sarha was to roam freely, at will, without restraint. The verb form of the word means to let the cattle out to pasture early in the morning, leaving them to wander and graze at liberty. A man going on a sarha wanders aimlessly, not restricted by time and place, going where his spirit takes him to nourish his soul and rejuvenate himself. But not any excursion would qualify as a sarha. Going on a sarha implies letting go. It's a drug-free high, Palestinian style. There was a time, I'm told, when the hills around Ramallah were one large cultivated garden with a house by every spring. Olive trees dotted their slopes and grapevines draped the terrace walls. But by the late 1970s, when I returned from my law studies in London, these hills were no longer being cultivated. Except for the indomitable olive trees, nothing that had been planted was growing in them. They had become an extensive nature reserve with springs and little ponds where frogs hopped undisturbed and deer leapt up and down the terrace walls where it was possible to walk unimpeded. When I returned from my law studies and began practicing law in Ramallah, the occupation was in its 11th year with little prospect of ending. Insidious but significant changes in the law provided strong indications of Israel's long-term policies towards the occupied territories, my home. Few seemed to be paying attention. A disquieting silence left me anxious and worried. The hills began to be my refuge against the practices of the occupation, both manifest and surreptitious, and the restrictions traditional society imposed on our life. I walked in them for escape and rejuvenation. End of the excerpt. This practice of taking a sarha in our hills is no longer possible. That is not to say that all hill walking is impossible nowadays. Just yesterday, the Shehadeh group took a walk in the Ramallah hills. So we still hike in the hills, but a sarha is no longer possible. And that is because the likelihood of encountering armed Jewish settlers or finding that the path has been blocked by a new settlement or a road leading to one makes the kind of carefree roaming so central to a sarha impossible. The extent to which Israeli rule over Palestine altered the landscape has been widely documented and known. Perhaps less known are the peculiar aspects of the struggle over the land in the West Bank, which I would like to mention here. The first of these is that all the Israeli plans for colonizing the West Bank landscape through building Israeli settlements were known and published as early as 1982. I wrote about these extensively in my 1985 book, Occupier's Law. I will read from the second of 7 walks described in Palestinian Walks. This is from page 55. I soon got to that part of the Wadi, which always inspired talk when I walked with Jonathan Kuttab, my colleague in human rights at El-Haq in 1981. Far away from town, next to the dry stream, between the hills, we would sit on the rock, our feet dangling in the grass. We talked of what lay ahead for us. We had both read the settlement master plan drawn by the Jewish Regional Council in the West Bank in cooperation with the Settlement Department of the World Zionist Organization. According to this plan, 80,000 Israeli Jews were to be settled in our hills by 1986 in 25 settlements and 20 outposts. To make this possible, $2 billion were to be allocated. Tons of concrete were to be poured over these hills. The plan called for paving roads at a rate of 150 kilometers a year. Every year, 500 dunums, a dunum is 1,000 square meters, of industrial zones would be developed. All the available natural resources would be monopolized by these settlers. Settlement blocks would spread over the entire area, and our towns and villages would be isolated, their growth hindered by a massive road network. And so it happened, just according to this plan already published in the early 80s. The boost for the settlements also came with the Oslo Accords of 1993, when settlement more than tripled in number. But something even more important then happened. The majority of the land in the West Bank was designated as Area C, and Israel proceeded to let it be known to its people that Area C would eventually be annexed to Israel. This led to a massive increase in the number of settlers. Those who were initially reluctant to settle in territory where they were not sure they would be allowed to remain once peace with the Palestinians was reached, were encouraged to move to the occupied territories. The education system in Israel also promoted the fiction that Greater Israel, which includes all the occupied territories, was land given by God to the Jews. And so in encounters with settlers, it was not uncommon to hear such retorts as, "You Palestinians don't belong here. This land was given to us by God." And who can argue with such supreme authority? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raja. I'm sure you'll see in the chat, but I, like many others, really appreciate hearing you read the words that many of us have read. Thank you very much for that. Our next speaker is Rana Baker. Rana is a Palestinian PhD student at Columbia University. Her research focuses on the study of infrastructure and environmental resources as microsites of political struggle in colonial and anti-colonial context. Please join me in welcoming Rana. Thank you, Rana.
Thank you, Samer, and thank you, Raja, for that amazing reading. I'd like to welcome everyone to our panel. It's a real honor to be part of this historic festival and to be among many friends and allies. I'd like to thank Susan Abelhawa especially, and all the organizers and interpreters for their tireless work and for bringing us together in the best of ways despite this pandemic. My brief presentation will address environmental politics and the possibilities of resistance in Palestine, although my primary focus is Gaza. I prepared this presentation in the spirit of self-critique. Over the past years, the environment became an important component of liberal discourse. Scientists are no longer the only spokespeople for the environment. Environmental politics is now a matter that concerns public opinion as well. As a self-purported liberal democracy, Israel has expanded its Hasbara to incorporate environmental issues and to use these issues to affirm its status as a progressive state. Of course, this idea of Israel as an environmentally conscious liberal democracy plays into Zionism's early Orientalist narrative of Palestine as an arid land which was never cultivated by its native inhabitants until European Zionist settlers established their moshavot or agricultural settlements. But this is all well known. What is relatively new is the way Israel has turned the discourse of liberal environmentalism against the Palestinians who resist its colonial violence. Gaza's incendiary kites, which emerged during Gaza's Great March of Return, is an important example. Incendiary kites or balloons were basically Molotov cocktails attached to these kites and balloons, then sent over to the Israeli side, where they eventually fell and caused fire to the Israeli agricultural crops. Israeli Zionists and many liberal voices accused Palestinians of environmental savagery. Israelis call them terror kites. In and of itself, Israel's reduction of Palestinian resistance into terror is not new. What was more curious in my view was that the pro-Palestinian legal and political discourse downplayed these kites and insisted on highlighting the peacefulness of the Great March. It was as if the Great March acquired its legitimacy from its peacefulness rather than the very conditions which gave rise to it in the first place. By conditions, they obviously mean over 7 decades of Israeli violence and colonial dispossession. There are a few points I'd like to make. First, while the liberal humanitarian discourse of international law can be tactically useful, I believe it is long overdue that we scholars, lawyers, activists go on the offensive. International law hardly distinguishes between a homemade incendiary kite and a bomb dropped from an Israeli warplane. Its legal principles, such as the principle of proportionality, are elusive enough to justify settler colonial violence as self-defense, or at best provide some inconsequential condemnation. International law has and will never provide us with the practical and discursive tools oriented toward liberation. It is not a liberatory discourse. Second, the possibilities of resistance are imposed. The colonized do not get to choose their means of resistance. The colonized are forced to be creative, given the colonizers' tendency to eliminate all possibilities of resistance. Gazans have been confined and isolated since 2007. They do not have the option of throwing stones at the Israeli soldiers or disrupting railway and transportation infrastructure, as occurs in the West Bank and 48 Palestine. Gaza and Israel are separated by a massive physical space. Anyone who approaches the fence gets shot. Homemade incendiary kites and balloons must therefore be understood as acts of creative disruption. They're effective precisely because they cause damage to Israel's agricultural economy and pit Israeli settlers against their government. They're also effective because Israel's military machine is incapable of neutralizing them. Israeli warplanes cannot bomb a kite, since bombing them would necessarily cause damage to Israeli agricultural communities. These acts of creative disruption must receive a full endorsement in public and private. If Palestinian resistance causes environmental damage, it is because there is an Israel to resist. It is crucial to recognize the material nature of colonialism. Israel relies on a vast military and civilian infrastructure without which the very settler colonial integrity of the state cannot survive. Sabotaging and disrupting this infrastructure lie at the heart of every liberation movement from North Dakota to Palestine. They're acts conducive to liberation, and we should not shy away from supporting them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rana, for that. It's given many of us a lot to think about, as you can see from the many comments in the chat. And thank you, Rana. Next, we are going to move on to our third panelist, Rabea Eghbaria, who's a doctoral candidate at Harvard Law School and a civil rights attorney in Adala. He wrote several articles on the intersection of law, land, food, and nature in Palestine, and led the legal case against the criminalization of Za'atar and Aqub. Rabea's latest project, Chasing Goats, Abducting Camels, Land, Landscape, Livestock, and the Law in Israel-Palestine, explores the legal history of livestock in Israel-Palestine, and received the Irving Oberman Prize in Legal History. Please join me in thanking and welcoming Rabea. Thank you, Rabea.
Thank you so much, Samer, Raja, and Rana for the brilliant words. I want to join you and thank all the organizers of the Palestine Writes Festival. It's a wonderful gathering. I'm really happy to be here. I will use my time to tell some stories, but before I start, I want to particularly take the time to remember all the lives of Palestinian children who were killed by the Israeli occupation. In March 2014, 14-year-old Youssef al-Shawamri was killed by soldiers while picking akub, a plant I'll be talking about today, after he crossed the wall to access his family's land. Yesterday, 13-year-old Ali Abu Alia was shot dead by soldiers while protesting. These words are for them. While in law school a few years ago, I curiously, half jokingly inserted the word Za'atar into the Israeli legal search engine. Since then, my life has unexpectedly changed. Although it's popular knowledge, especially among older women, that picking Za'atar from the ward has been criminalized, I did not really imagine that prosecutors actually charge defendants and courts hear criminal cases and write verdicts revolving around nothing else but Za'atar. As I started assembling the legal pieces together, I understood that Ariel Sharon, then Minister of Agriculture, first declared Za'atar as a protected plant and therefore criminalized its picking in 1977. Akub's criminalization followed in 2004 when Sharon was serving simultaneously as the Prime Minister of Israel and the Minister of Environmental Protection. I became obsessed with Za'atar and Akub. I started going all around Palestine to research, tell the story, and later when I joined Adala, the Palestinian Human Rights Center that I work at, also legally challenge the criminalization of these herb plants. Or put more broadly, the criminalization of Palestinian herb picking culture. In the next few minutes, I'll try to show how Za'atar and Akub can make us see what is otherwise camouflaged, hidden under the ostensibly innocent and apolitical conceptions of nature. Spring 2019, Jamal was caught by the Israeli Nature Protection Authority with about 10 kilograms of Za'atar. The Israeli Nature Protection Authority not only operates in Israel, but also in collaboration with the army in what the Oslo Accords classify as Area C, as Raja said, in the West Bank. Jamal was caught there. He had been stopped for several hours, investigated, and his car seized and taken from him. For the 2 months to come, Jamal had to commute his 14-year-old son from Sanur, his village, to nearby Jenin for kidney treatment 3 times a week, using private cabs. Being unemployed, Jamal struggled to secure the payments. I assured Jamal we would be getting his car back soon. But in fact, I knew very little how to navigate the Kafkaesque situation of a military system seizing a car because of Za'atar. Army procedures were no procedures. Come back next week, send a letter, today is a holiday. After a few weeks, we finally got all the approvals to get the car back. It was parked in a facility near Beit El settlement. I drove from Haifa and picked up Jamal near Ramallah. We were ready to go. Driving with a yellow plate, namely an Israeli plate for those who don't know the yellow and green plates, the navigation app made us drive through some settlers' entrance of Beit El without us understanding. Once we stepped out of the car, we were met with a soldier approaching us with a pointed gun. Had he only known we were there for Za'atar. For the next few hours, we found ourselves wandering in the military base with soldiers trying to find the keys for the car who the soldiers had lost. Eventually, the key was found in the car itself. Jamal could finally drive back home. Jamal's story is only one among many. A couple of years ago, I accompanied Samir and Nadia to an Akub harvest. We woke up before sunrise and drove all the way to the occupied Jawlan, where Akub grows extensively. Samir and Nadia are experienced pickers and have learned that if you wake up early enough, you can minimize your chances of being caught. Nature patrols, after all, love sleeping. By 7 a.m., we were driving back home with our breakfast in hand. But this could have ended much differently. 48 Palestinians who are subjected to the Israeli civil legal system rather than the military one are caught, investigated, fined, or tried in criminal courts for picking or possessing any amount of za'atar or akub from the wild. Samer and Nadia know this way too well. They've been sentenced several times. They can tell you for hours how the prosecutors and the courts regularly engage in civilizing discourses. The courts uproot za'atar and akub from Palestinian culture and plant them as criminal substances in the legal field. In a 2017 article, I analyzed more than 60 court decisions delivered in between 2003 to 2016 in za'atar and akub cases. Maybe needless to say, but all the defendants were Palestinian. A quote from a prosecutor in one of these cases gives a strong illustration of the civilizing discourse that is reflected in the legal policies of preservation. I'm quoting, "Although the amount of akub picked was not large, I, the prosecutor says, believe that the court should join the prosecution's efforts to uproot this phenomenon from its roots. Unfortunately, many defendants do not understand the severity of their actions when they come and tell me privately that they had picked a small amount for the household and this is how we were raised for generations." End of quote. Za'atar and akub undergo an unfooding process under the law in favor of a purified perception of nature that distances itself from Palestinian culture. After the court dissects the herb picking from the plate, the way is paved for depicting the picking as a criminal act and convicting the defendants under the pretext of nature protection. But the akub and za'atar pickers find creative ways to reclaim agency, ridicule the ban, and retell the story as one of resistance. Samer says, for example, "Court trial fees, we don't think about it. It's part of the pressure that Israel puts on us to starve us out." Even in court protocols, you can find the following exchange. Question: "Do you know that picking za'atar is prohibited?" Answer: "Yes, I know it is prohibited. Prohibited for Arabs, permitted for Jews." These acts are best depicted as everyday forms of resistance, to borrow a term by James Scott. As one akub picker says, they chase us. Why do they chase us? For some thorns of akub? Prohibited or not, we are going to pick it. The story of herb picking criminalization has many details which I unfortunately left untold. The commercialization and appropriation of za'atar by the Israeli Ben Harut family, the scientific discourses and claims that envelop the ban, the role that the Arab judges themselves play in all this story. But I want to just say that in 2019, however, we managed in Adala to expose the disputed character of the purported scientific evidence and invoke legal and public pressure that pressed Israel to lift the absolute ban on picking za'atar and akub. The unfolding of the pandemic makes it unclear how the new policies will be implemented on the ground in the future. But za'atar is not just an incident. It is not a standalone story. It is a chapter, an episode in a much, much wider story about settler colonial violence toward natives and their land, landscape, livestock, and nature. Recently, I've been exploring a parallel story of Israeli patrols chasing nothing else than goats and camels. The first time I saw a picture of a camel airlifted by a crane was in January 2019. It took me a few moments to realize what I was actually seeing. The camel looked terrified, as if it were screaming while suspended in the air. The scene was bizarre, cruel, perplexing, you name it. In fact, it struck me that I could not have conceived the situation had I not seen the image. But after all, why would a camel be tied so terribly and airlifted by a crane? And here I think it's a good time to share screen and show you a couple of pictures for illustration. And I'm nearly done. So this is akub for those of you who have never seen akub. This is while it's cleansed. This is a sign that the Nature Protection Authority puts sometimes to notify about the prohibition. This is Jamal after we freed his car, the za'atar car. And these are Samer and Nadia in the akub harvest. And this is the picture of the camel I was talking about. So I will leave the full answer for a different occasion about the camel, but to oversimplify, it is the most It is that most camels in the Naqab do not have and cannot have permits to graze. They are further accused of becoming a road safety problem. Israel has managed to produce the camel, the ship of the desert, as a road safety problem. The point is that together these stories of criminalizing Za'atar, chasing camels, and others form a wider picture of how settler colonial legal arrangements criminalize, control, micromanage, and dispossess Palestinians from land, subsistence, culture, and nature, often under the pretext of nature protection and scientific expertise. I hope that exposing these stories, telling them from the bottom up, may help to give concrete examples of how the Nakba, as an ongoing process rather than an event, is reflected in brutal, somewhat surreal, even comic ways, in the smallest details of Palestinians' relationship with land and nature. For closure, I want to quote a great Palestinian writer, Salman Natur, who once wrote, نحن جعلنا من الزعتر سلاحا نواجه به الأمم الاستعمارية قاطبة. يلقون علينا النابالم ونحن نرشهم بالزعتر. We've made za'atar into an effective weapon against imperialism. They drop bombs on us and we spray them with za'atar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabea. That was wonderful. Your comments, especially towards the end about acting on nature in the name of protecting it, reminded me of a comment that Rana made about the centrality of environmental discourse to Zionist myth-making and acting upon the land of Palestine. Before we get to Andrew, I would like to remind everyone again, please, if you are tweeting about this or about the panel or about the festival, please use the hashtag Palestine Writes. All of us moderators have a bet to see how many tweets we can get. I'm just joking, but hopefully that joke will encourage you to tweet about this panel. Remind you again, if you do require translation, to use the interpretation key at the bottom of the Zoom room. And to please also use the Q&A button. I see that there are 6 questions in there now. So I will likely go immediately to them after Andrew's talk, but please do leave questions in the Q&A because the chat is very busy and will be difficult to monitor for questions.
Samer, can I interrupt and go to Rabea and tell him something that was in my book of 1980, The West Bank and the Rule of Law, when I mentioned about Za'atar and the criminalization of picking Za'atar. And in a review in the Hebrew press, they said Shehadeh is so mad and thinks that everything is so incredible that he even accuses Israel of criminalizing Za'atar. And at that time, all the military orders were not published and were actually secret. And they said it's impossible that Israel can leave these things secret, and they denied that they existed. That was in 1980. Things have moved since then, but not to the better.
Incredible. Thank you, Raja. Our last speaker is Andrew Ross, who is a professor of social and cultural analysis and director of the American Studies program at NYU, contributor to The Guardian, The New York Times, The Nation, and Al Jazeera. He is the author or editor of more than 20 books, including Creditocracy and the Case for Debt Refusal, Bird on Fire, Nice Work If You Can Get It, Fast Boat to China, No Collar, and The Celebration Chronicles. His most recent book from Verso, which is available in the showroom, is Stone Men, The Palestinians Who Built Israel, an excellent book that won a Palestine Book Award in 2019. Please join me in welcoming Andrew. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you so much, Samer. I'm joining you from downtown Manhattan on Lenni Lenape land. And I'm going to try to speak slowly for the translators. I mean, I speak slowly anyway, so. There is so much to say on this topic, and I've learned so much from the other panelists so far. I'm going to take literally the session prompt to speak about my own published work, which narrows down the scope. My book, which is stone man, Palestinians who built Israel, tells the story of Palestine's stone industry and how its workers have produced and used the stone to construct most of the built environment on the lands of historic Palestine. Stone masonry, as many of you might know, has a very rich and venerated artisanal history in Palestine. And today the industry is the biggest private employer, providing the largest share of GDP and also exports. But it's also an extractive industry, and so it causes a great deal of environmental damage to land, air, and water. So what role did stone extraction and stone masonry play in settler colonialism? To speak directly to the topic, well, historically speaking, for many forms of colonialism, extraction has been the name of the game. The primary goal of the colonists has been to exploit and drain off as many resources as possible, using local labor to do so. Under settler colonialism, however, the primary goal is land acquisition. And over the last century, Palestinian lands have seen both of these predatory forms, although the settler one is probably better known. Under the British mandate, the Dead Sea, for example, was a capital-intensive focus for salt and mineral extraction, although the British were mostly interested in using Palestine as a strategic land route for running a pipeline from the Mosul oil fields in Iraq to the Mediterranean port of Haifa. After the Nakba, we saw an increase in stone production from the quarries in order to supply the expanding infrastructure of the Israeli state. And then when the occupation began, we saw a more systematic exploitation of the West Bank's resources. The stone quarries inside 48 were shut down for environmental reasons and because, no one wants to live near a quarry, but also because it was much cheaper to outsource the business across the Green Line, where some of the best dolomitic limestone in the world happens to be located in the central highlands of the West Bank. So at that time, quarry owners in Palestine's famous stone villages were offered deals and loans to expand their operations in order to supply Israel's construction needs. And what had been a relatively small scale local craft became much more of an industrial enterprise. And as a result, over time, some firms scaled up to compete internationally. With industrialization, of course, the scope of environmental damage was magnified. And the West Bank's storybook hills, so lovingly and also so tragically evoked earlier by Raja, were disfigured by strip mining and the waste product from the industry's processing factories. When we think about outsourcing in Palestine, we usually think about the dirty or hazardous facilities that have been relocated across the Green Line to the settlement industrial zones, right? Especially the one north of Tulkarem, which is the go-to location for the dumping of Israel's toxic waste. It's not customary to think of Palestinian stone as an outsourced industry, but I think it's important to see it in this light, especially if we're to approach the topic of the panel honestly. So aside from its low-wage manpower, the West Bank has two resources that Israel lacks. The first is water, which of course is systematically stolen and diverted and siphoned off from Central Highland aquifers using advanced pumping technologies, all of which have led to the chronic depletion of the aquifers and in addition, of course, the River Jordan. The second resource is the West Bank's limestone, which is mostly under Palestinian control and ownership, although much of the remaining reserves lie in Area C. And so their ultimate destiny remains uncertain, to say the least. As for the stone quarried by Palestinian producers in areas A and B, some of it goes to local needs, some of it's exported to other countries in the region, but more than 70% is used to supply Israel and its spreading archipelago of settlements. So the cruel irony here is that the very contents of Palestinian land are being extracted and transferred in order to build out the settler state and its West Bank colonies. Now, Palestine is rarely compared to countries that are economically reliant on the extraction of a single resource, but it does have something in common with oil producers like Angola or Nigeria, where activists struggle to protect their fellow citizens from environmental harm on the one hand, and from corporate profiteers and kleptocratic officials on the other. In fact, Palestine stone is sometimes referred to as white oil, and its people suffer in their own way from the much discussed resource curse, which delivers a range of poisonous environmental impacts along with some prosperity to countries that have such a precious natural asset. So while the stone industry in Palestine operates at the behest of the occupier, its impact on the land is also badly underregulated by the Palestinian Authority. Neglect of health and safety is a chronic complaint among workers, as I found, who suffer from a range of occupational illnesses, as do residents who live in proximity to the quarries and the open-walled factories. A range of ailments, including cancers, are well known, but there is a conspiracy of silence around them. And I found the lack of safety measures is actually the top-ranked issue prioritized by worker unions. In addition, very few of the spent quarries have been rehabilitated for public use, which is an industry practice much more common in Europe and North America. So those of you who know the landscape know that the open pits scar the countryside. There's also very little recycling of the millions of tons of slurry waste, which annually degrade the air and contaminate flora, fauna, and soil, along with surface and groundwater. There's no doubt that the Palestinian Authority could surely be doing a better job of protecting the environment and the industry's workforce, but it's also important to see the overall picture in the context of the occupation. And it's fair to say that the industry then provides some of Palestine's best paying domestic jobs with few of the risks and humiliations involved in crossing the green line to work in 48. But as with other recipients of outsourced industries, the Palestinian Authority has no better alternative to offer. The industry's profiteering owners, which again are Palestinian, sustain these jobs at the cost of intensive environmental damage at the same time as they're forced to supply the occupier. So I think it's fair to conclude that of the two colonial forms that I mentioned earlier, resource colonialism and settler colonialism, the Palestinian people bear the brunt of both of them simultaneously. And I should add, and I'm aware that this may sound provocative to some of you, Palestine's own capitalists play a role in enabling the overlap between these two forms of colonialism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you to all of our panelists. Those were excellent interventions. And I very much appreciate that you provided those comments within the time frame that we had agreed on. In the interest of time and getting to the many comments and questions from the audience, I will forego any questions now to the panelists and go immediately to the Q&A. And if I'm lucky enough to have any time at the end, we'll ask some of the questions that I have for our panelists. I think what we'll do now is go to the individual questions addressed to the panelists. If you have questions for somebody, please put them in the Q&A now. We'll start with the individual questions and then move on to more collective discussions. There's some very interesting questions in here that I think bring together many of the themes of the panel. Let's start with the beginning with Raja. Raja, there's a question from someone I'm just going to read the question. Perhaps it'll make it easier for our translators as well. It's the third question. Thank you for your comments and reading from Palestinian Walks, which I love. I've always wondered about the ending of that book when you share a pipe with a settler. 2 questions. Do you see this as an overly utopian ending? Did this actually happen? Raja?
Well, I'll start with the second one. Did it actually happen? What happened was that I was walking one time with a friend near the site which I describe as where the discussion happened. And I saw this settler sitting there and smoking a pipe, an nargile. And we passed by quickly, neither of us recognizing the existence of the other, and continued on our walk. And happy, of course, he had his gun next to him. And so it was not an occasion to speak to somebody with a gun. And later on, I was thinking, what if I'd stopped and talked to him and seen what he thinks? And, you know, the settlement from which he comes, which is called Dolev, was started in 1980. And ever since it started, I've been concerned that in this settlement, there will be children born to whom the hills that I like and which are part of my life and next to where I live will also become part of their life, and how complicated this is going to make everything in the future. And so all these issues were in my mind, and I was thinking that I would like to explore them with this man in a virtual way and see where it gets us. So I told him my version, he told me his version, and that was what happened. Now, I appreciate that our land is so beautiful that it can be loved by everybody, enemy and friend. And so I don't feel that I have exclusive right to love that land, except that they love it and destroy it and prevent us from enjoying it. That's the problem. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Raja. And as Andrew's presentation reminds us that capitalists are very much fueling the destruction through the exploitation of Palestinian labor of the land. I'd like to go next to Rana. Rana, there are 2 questions for you. I'll just ask them both, if that's okay. The first one, to those of us who are in solidarity with Palestine and engage in BDS work, what are other methods of creative disruption in which we can engage? And the second, where can we look to find alternative, more liberatory discourses beyond the rot and violence of liberalism and international law around Palestinian ecology? Rana?
Thank you. So other acts of creative disruption. The first thing I want to say is that BDS is creative disruption in the sense that the tactic on which it is founded is to basically look for the sources of Israel's capital flows and try to disrupt those. So the protests, the flash mobs, the boycotts that take place against Israeli businesses are precisely what we should be focusing on, especially if we live abroad. And that's one of the few tactics that we can follow in order to precisely disrupt and cut off the capital flows and the foundation, which are the foundations of the Israeli economy, really. So other acts of creative disruption other than BDS, I think it depends on where we are geographically. But I think movements such as Black Lives Matter, for instance, they are part and parcel of the Palestinian struggle. And so all that, the protests, basically the direct confrontations with the American police, I think these are important acts of creative disruption that we can be involved in as part of our solidarity, for Palestine, but also definitely Black people's struggle in the US. And so I think that's the answer to this question. So what was the other question? Sorry, I didn't keep track.
Sorry, Rana. The other question was, where can we look to find alternative, more liberatory discourses beyond the rot and violence of liberalism and international law around Palestinian ecology?
So I think it's the language of confrontation that people in Palestine use on the ground. People in Palestine do not talk about, I'm talking about people on the ground, people like who actually face the violence of the Israeli military machine. So people who stone throwers, for instance. I think we should really borrow from their language. It is a confrontational language. It is not apologetic. It does not try to justify itself by using any law, precisely because law does not even see us as subjects, as legal subjects. International law does not really recognize us. We're not a state, and we're not legal subjects or like rights-bearing people. And so I don't see why there is so much emphasis among like in the Palestine solidarity world, basically, why there's so much focus on international law. I think we should really be focusing on direct confrontation, whether that is a linguistic confrontation, so in terms of the language that we use in order to rationalize and talk about the Palestinian struggle, but also I think in our very acts, in what we do. So for example, instead of asking the permission of the police to protest, I think we should just like occupy the streets and not, because that is what makes them disruptive. Getting permission from the police does not make them disruptive at all, in my opinion. And so, yeah, this is what I think.
Thank you, Rana. It's a reminder that an appeal to the colonizers' laws does not always lead to where we think they will lead. Thank you for that, those responses, Rana. Rabea, there's a question for you. I'm going to read it. It's just come in. The question is, I was wondering if you could speak more about commercialized za'atar and how that industry may have benefited from the ban on picking the wild plant.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, wow, it has a very long history. Couple of things. In 1977, when actually the za'atar was prohibited, up until then, the source for za'atar for actually people's households was nature. People used to go to nature and pick za'atar. Nature was predominantly the main source of za'atar for people. But once it was criminalized, the criminalization had a kind of exception, which is cultivated za'atar, what they call commercialized za'atar or domesticated za'atar. And the domestication process happened simultaneously, hand in hand with the ban in 1977. So the Ben Harud family were a family in one of the Mushavim, and they used the land, which actually in the same time, the land day, what was happening, many Palestinian citizens lost their lands to kibbutzim and Mushavim. And in any way, the Ben Harud family basically started commercializing za'atar and started selling. I want to maybe, actually, I have here one of the quotes of this family. I want to show how they were a monopoly of za'atar in Palestine until 2003, in Israel at least, until 2003. Later, some Palestinians started growing commercialized za'atar as well in the West Bank and Gaza. So it's a complex story. I can't provide a full answer to it, but it's worthy actually noting that the commercialized za'atar that many people today have may also be, its source may not be in nature, but commercialized in Israel by Israeli corporations. And the Ben Harud saying that in an 80s interview, I'm quoting here, I gave it to my father, one of the son says, to sell it in the West Bank. And we saw that it has commercial potential. The interviewers ask, did you sell? The Yoram Ben Harud says, yes, they did not have za'atar. I remember that I walked with my father in Nablus. And they, the Palestinians, ran after us yelling za'atar, za'atar. Soon after we saw that it is going well, we extended the lot. So the story of actually commercializing za'atar goes hand in hand with dispossessing Palestinians from land and with its prohibition criminally in 1977.
Thank you very much, Rabea. Rabea, we're going to stay with you because another question came in for you, if that's okay. I'm going to ask this question and then introduce Susie, or invite Susie to join in and respond to another question and comment that has come in. Rabea, here's the question. Are Palestinian activists nurturing linkages with other indigenous nations and peoples that are also facing similar catastrophic threats to their natural environments as well as their identity? Sometimes I feel we have not fully realized the parallels with the struggles of other indigenous communities around the globe, such as in the Americas and Africa, etc. What is your feeling?
I completely agree that there is a huge potential that is that can be used, particularly around nature. There is a lot of parallels between settler colonial cases. You know, Palestine is not exceptional in this sense, and the criminalization of za'atar is very similar to the criminalization of hunting and fishing rights sometimes in America and Canada. In the US and Canada, although in some senses the legal framework is much more complex, and it's harder to sometimes compare. But za'atar is, in this sense, is just an example of a case in Palestine, and Aqoub, of course, and it has parallels also in Australia, where a case went up to the Supreme Court in Australia, and indigenous rights to fish. Now, I'm not also drawing the parallels. There's a lot of distinctions that can be happening, but definitely Palestinian struggle is a struggle of liberation. It's a struggle, it's a settler colonial struggle that has many parallels when it comes to nature with many nations. And I do think there is a lot to explore and build solidarities in this area. Yeah. I agree.
Thank you very much, Rabea. Actually, I'm going to contradict myself and actually move to Andrew now, and then we'll come back to the BDS question later on and some other interesting questions for the panelists as a whole. Andrew, I thought that, sorry, the question is for me because it's on the tip of my tongue. I've been holding it since your talk. So I hope it's okay to receive a question from me on this. I really appreciate how you turn attention to the role of Palestinian capitalists in the story that you're telling, not only in your presentation, but in the book. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about, I like how Raja talked about the hills as refuge, about Rana talking about creative disruption, this language of how people use the landscape to engage in resistance to colonization. Could you speak about that from the perspective of the Palestinian workers and what their relationship is to process of extraction and resistance?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. And there's also a comment in the chat that's related that I want to pick up on from Ryan Al-Natur, who said, Palestinian capitalists, can we stop calling them Palestinians and start calling them collaborators? You know, which is a fair question. But so let me try and provide a context, because the story about capitalism in Palestine is less well known, I think, than others, and there is a reluctance to talk about class conflict in particular, you know, in the name of nationalist unity and so on and so forth. This is a very typical condition under colonial occupation or under colonial rule in any nationalist movement. But it is the case that colonial capitalism does need a comprador class of indigenous capitalists to do its business successfully, and Palestine has its share of them who perform that role at the same time as they will proclaim themselves to be Palestinian nationalists. And there's a very broad spectrum, a range from, you know, the families the families that are in the circle of so-called crony capitalists around the PA, who enjoy monopolistic share of trade on the provision of services and goods that come from Israel, all the way down to, you know, a small-time capitalist in my bailiwick, let's say someone who owns a quarry or a stone processing factory. And they're mostly family-owned businesses. All of the firms in the industry are family-owned. They're small, and they are they're families that know each other for a long, long time. So when they compete with each other, they do it very carefully. It's not a cutthroat form of capitalism. It's not exactly predatory. It's a form of careful competition. But they are, you know, they're obviously profit-oriented, and their interests are at odds with those of their workers. I found there's very little overlap between these small capitalist producers and you know, the crony capitalists who are sort of mercantile and finance-oriented, and so on and so forth. So it's difficult to talk about. It's important to talk about their interests as somehow being specific to what they do. In terms of the workers themselves, I did a lot of interviews with workers and owners, and as you would expect, or you might expect, that there would be testimony about class conflict that would emerge. I found less of it than I expected. A lot more commentary and testimony about the safety issues involved in the industry. And interestingly, and this kind of relates to the BDS question, which we might get to, I found very few workers have really anything to say about how they see the impact of BDS on their lives. And for me, that was, I mean, on the one hand, it's not surprising, but it was also quite dismaying. Having been involved in BDS work myself before I went to do this research in the West Bank, and finding how little of it was making a difference in any way whatsoever, and how few of these workers actually had heard of the movement and its scope. Again, I think the reluctance to speak about things does, you know, relate to this, the need for nationalist unity. You know, you can trace it back to Arafat's proclamation that, you know, internal forms of justice will have to wait until we've solved the colonial problem. That's the one that comes first. One of the problems with that kind of position is that capitalist habits become ingrained over time, and they not just at the everyday level, but some of you might not know that Article 21 of Palestine's Basic Law enshrines free market capitalism as the default economic principle of Palestine, which is, you know, obviously a result of the Oslo Accords, but it's very rare. I don't think I know of another country where that is actually the case. So I've gone on for long enough. I think it's just important to raise these issues and also connect them to the environmental damage that's the topic of this panel.
Thank you, Andrew. We do have a number of questions coming in, and a number that were directed at the panelists collectively at the beginning. So I think what we'll do now is have 2 rounds of collective questions. I am interpreting them as they appeared in the Q&A, and thank you to everybody who has put them in there. If I have misrepresented the question, please let me know. So I'm going to ask 3 of them now, open it up, and then ask another round of questions. The first one, I think, is a really interesting one on the representation of Za'atar in Darwish's work. And perhaps we can expand that discussion beyond Darwish and to other Palestinian writers. The second relates to the draining of marshes in the 1950s. And the third is if we could expand the discussion a bit to include the assault or criminalization on Palestinian olive production and Palestinian water. So I will open that up to anybody who wants, from the panelists who wants to intervene.
I would like to speak on the holy question. And just to remind people that Israel has always said that the holy drainage of the holy was related to the stopping of the mosquitoes that bear malaria. And the fact is that malaria was already under control because DDT was already used during the mandate times. So there was no relationship really between the draining of the holy and the control over malaria. I think that draining of the holy was one of those ways in which Israel wanted to impress the world by how amazing it can do great projects. And as a result of the draining of the holy, there was a lot of damage done to the Tiberias Lake. And it freed land, but Israel was not, they had more lands than it could use because it had taken over all the lands that they forced the Palestinians out of. So there was no real reason for the draining of the holy except arrogance and bombastic projects that Israel wanted to impress the world with.
Thank you, Raja. Rabea or Andrew?
Yeah, I can speak about the Darwish and the Za'atar question. I think it's fair to say that, I mean, Darwish wrote his famous poem Ahmad al-Za'atar in 1976, and obviously against the background of the massacre in Beirut in Lebanon, Tel al-Za'atar massacre. And I think indeed that moment, 1976, after the massacre, Za'atar became to have a new meaning for Palestinians. I'm not saying that it didn't have a significance before, but definitely you can see a pick after, in at least in poetry. Mahmoud Darwish wrote about it, Taha Muhammad Ali wrote about it, Hanna Abu Hanna and other poets invoke Za'atar as a symbol, I think, for particularly for refugees and for their connection to Palestine and the land. And it's interesting, I think, to note that the criminalization came a year after, in 1977. I don't want to, draw direct lines, but one can speculate maybe the importance of, the Za'atar and it invoked some national tensions that reflected in the Za'atar fields in 1977, actually, funnily enough, it was in the 2nd of November 1977 when Sharon declared the Za'atar, which is, as many of you might know, it's the Balfour Declaration. It's also in the 2nd of November. So there is a lot of symbolism in all this. Aqub has a different story as well, and I think the criminalization came later, only in 2004-05, and these orders, legally speaking, are relevant both to Israel per se and the West Bank. They are extended to the West Bank through military orders. This is the context. I would say that it constitutes an attack against Palestinians. Now, I want to mention one more thing about all this, because many people might ask me and think that I'm, attacking science per se, and there is like scientific expertise there that's saying, picking any leaf of Za'atar will make Za'atar extinct or whatever. It's first, it's not true. Second, we exposed in our work, especially in Adala, that basically the rationale that the NPA, the Nature Protection Authority, provides for it is first, there is no basis for it, a scientific basis, but also it's disputed among the scientific community itself, highly disputed. And obviously, for generations, Palestinians have been picking Za'atar and Aqub, etc. It didn't get extinct. People who do not pick it from the roots, I don't think they constitute any danger. But again, we can see these policies of using scientific language to envelop oppressive policies, oppressive measures. And it's what Raja just said about al-Huli is very resonates again, or is a parallel to that language, right? You know, you use scientific expertise. We, the colonizers, the Europeans, are coming to save the savages, the colonized people from and enlighten them with our knowledge. And it reflects itself in Huli, in planting, definitely, and in livestock policies.
Thank you, Rabea. Andrew, Rana, would you like to address any of the questions?
I can, I guess I can take the question about Rawabi. There are a couple of questions, I think, about Rawabi. Rawabi is a topic that everyone has a very strong opinion about on the West Bank. At least I found this to be the case. And it's impossible to avoid because it has such a, physically imposing position and exerts such a kind of, sublime fascination, which also is an object of hatred because of the way it's built. And there's quite a lot of, there's quite a number of pages in my book devoted to Rawabi. I did a lot of interviewing with workers and architects, and also with Mazri himself, Bashar Mazri, who's the developer and is probably the most sort of, well-known of these sort of active Palestinian nationalists / entrepreneurial capitalists who engages in joint ventures with not just with Israelis, but Gulf elites and so on and so forth. That's one of the reasons why I think he and Rawabi there's so much attention to them, and they're targeted because they're so high profile. That said, again, you can follow that pattern all the way down the chain to small capitalists, even in the stone industry, who make deals with settlements, who make deals with soldiers, with Israeli soldiers, to smooth the way for the passage of stone. And obviously, this is not particularly transparent, but in the stone villages, people tend to know about these things. And so there is a very subtle form of ostracism that operates, for producers who are particularly zealous in those kinds of joint ventures. And so, again, this is just to reinforce those patterns. On the other hand, thinking again about my interviews with workers, I was struck by how little visions of alternatives came up, like worker cooperatives or worker-run companies or enterprises. And again, I think this speaks to the penetration or the saturation of capitalist mentality across the landscape and in people's minds. That at least at the level of economic productivity, it's so difficult to imagine these alternatives under the occupation.
I'd like to add, if I may.
Of course.
As a person who loves the land in Palestine, I was very distressed by Rawabi's establishment, because it happens to be in an area which was particularly attractive. And when you think, what was the point of Rawabi? It didn't resolve any problem, any housing problem. If they had built houses in existing villages or worked on expanding some of the existing villages, it would have been much better without destroying another area of land to create a settlement like Arab city. Mm-hmm. It's very tragic, I think.
Yeah, I agree with you entirely, Raja. I mean, Mazri and his advocates would say we're providing a model, a middle class model of living that hadn't been available on a hilltop in the same way in the West Bank, and that's a first. And as Palestinian nationalists, you know, we should be interested in it. I'm just paraphrasing his position. I wonder if you would. I wonder what your views would be on the hilltop suburbs to the north of Ramallah. You know, which also. I mean, they're not in such an imposing situation, and perhaps they're not in landscapes that you might consider so aesthetically appealing. But don't they fall within the same range?
I'm very distressed by these projects, housing projects near Ramallah, because every time you look at them, you think it's a settlement, and they're built like a settlement. And the amount of destruction that they have caused to the land is also tremendous. So it's very distressing. But then, you know, part of the reason why Palestinians are not taking more care to build more carefully is because for many years now, Palestinians have not been having access to the countryside. And so their attachment and love of the countryside has been reduced. And so they don't know what they are destroying because they never knew what it was like before. And that's very sad. But also the style of building is like a settlement.
Yes.
Conform, every house is like the other, uniform and so on.
It's American suburban. That's what it is.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Raja. In the interest of time, Rana is going to conclude the session with some responses to the previous questions and the question about Gaza that was in the Q&A. Rana?
Yes. So the question about Gaza and the Israeli, what Israel basically does to the soil and so on. I think there are two main levels in which Israel has been extremely damaging. First, environmentally speaking, of course. The first one is the residues of the bombs that Israel uses. So these actually remain in the soil and cause like perpetual damage, or if not perpetual, then it actually will take like decades, and in some cases actually like a century before like they actually disintegrate and decompose, and before the land is going to become fertile again. So that's one thing. The other thing is actually just the way Israel prevents Palestinian farmers from cultivating their land. So some of the richest land in Gaza is actually at the border with at the border with Israel, or what Israel calls a border, although it's actually just like a fence. And so whenever farmers try to plant their land, or whenever they try to cultivate it, Israeli bulldozers just like come and bulldoze the entire area. And so like even like attempts at actually, you know, cultivating the land, or acts of, you know, like trying to like even produce an agricultural economy, these attempts are like systematically destroyed by the Israelis, precisely because Gaza is under siege, right? And Gaza being under siege means that it relies mostly on imports from the Israeli side. And so it is in the best interest of Israel that Gazans function only as consumers, that they do not produce their own food, and that they perpetually and constantly depend on expensive imports from Israel. So we're like actually a huge consumptive market for the Israelis.
And not to forget the insecticides that they spray and cause the land to be poisoned.
Yes.
This is, if I can add one, this is a point, I mean, a process, the commercialization of Palestinian society in general, but for 48 Palestinians, this is a process that is very, very clear that happened during the 50s and 60s, where under the military, when the military regime was imposed on Palestinians, there was a strong push to urbanize, and especially the Bedouins, but to urbanize and make Palestinian society a consumerist society, you know, and this confiscations of land, they are ways, and again, the criminalization is not just another manifestation of these policies in a way to push the Palestinian away from the field into the city and to become, a wage-dependent human being rather than a sustainable farmer or a sustainable subsistence dependent. So it has different manifestations in Gaza, in 48, in West Bank, and I think it's just important for us as Palestinians to keep reminding ourselves to draw these parallels, because we're always fragmented by the occupation, and it's hard to create these sometimes narratives that are all encompassing.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rabea. I'm going to take this opportunity to end the panel. I know that there's a lot to talk about. I'm sorry that we don't have more time, but I know that everyone is busy and there's lots to do at the festival. Please join me in thanking Raja, Rabea, Rana, and Andrew. Thank you so much. This was delightful. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have moderated this panel and hope that we get to do something like this again in the near future. I'd also like to thank Susie, Andrew, and all of the other organizers who happen to be here for doing this and bringing us together. This is really wonderful. And of course, I'd like to thank Haifa and Rawan, the interpreters. I hope that we have not made your job very difficult. And we appreciate everything that you've done to make this accessible for everyone. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate your time today, and thank you for your comments, questions, and for being here. Thank you.
Thank you.